My wife said, "I have plenty of options and I can replace you tomorrow," so I walked away and became irreplaceable. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the person you cherish most can fail to value you until it's too late. I met Julia during our late 20s in Portland. We were the definition of inseparable. One of those couples friends would point to as the benchmark for relationship goals. We shared a connection that seemed effortless. Midnight hikes under the stars, profound conversations that stretched until dawn. Two souls completely entwined in each other's orbit. When we tied the knot 3 years later at a small ceremony overlooking the Columbia River Gorge, it felt like the natural progression of our journey together. We had such ambitious dreams. We talked about exploring Southeast Asia, renovating an old Victorian in the West Hills, and eventually welcoming children into our lives. For the first few years, everything unfolded exactly as we'd imagined. I was building my architectural firm from scratch, often putting in 16-hour days to establish my reputation in the competitive Portland design scene. Despite the demands of growing my business, Julia remained my priority. I carved out time for her, surprising her with weekend getaways to the Oregon coast, planning elaborate anniversary dinners, or simply making sure we had uninterrupted time together after exhausting days. In the beginning, Julia appreciated these efforts. She would beam with pride when introducing me to her colleagues at the publishing house, where she worked as an editor. She was my staunchest supporter, my confidant, the person who believed in my vision even when projects fell through. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The change started subtly. Julia began mentioning her need for me time, explaining that she wanted to focus more on herself. Initially, I encouraged this. Everyone needs space for personal growth. I supported her when she joined a weekly book club, started taking pottery classes, and spent more weekends away with her friends. What I didn't realize was that focusing on herself would eventually morph into something else entirely. It wasn't about healthy self-development. It became about doing whatever she wanted regardless of how it affected our marriage. She stopped participating in our relationship. Our conversations about renovating our first home together faded away. She rarely asked about my day or showed interest in the architectural competition I'd finally been invited to judge. Yet, remarkably, she still expected me to treat her as though she were the sun around which my entire universe revolved. I told myself this was merely a difficult phase. Every marriage weathers storms, doesn't it? So I doubled my efforts. I avoided confrontation whenever possible. If something bothered me, like her increasingly frequent girls' nights that would end with her stumbling home at 3 a.m., I would attempt a calm conversation. But when these discussions threatened to escalate, I would swallow my concerns rather than press the issue. I began surprising her with thoughtful gifts. A first-edition copy of her favorite novel, the artisan pottery wheel she'd been admiring, even the designer watch she'd pointed out during our anniversary trip to Seattle. I was desperate to rekindle the connection we once had, to remind her that I was still devoted. None of it made a difference. She would offer perfunctory thanks, but there was no genuine appreciation, just a distracted smile before her attention drifted back to her phone. When Julia said she needed space to find herself, I didn't push back. I assumed this was part of her personal journey, so I stepped back and gave her the freedom she requested. I stopped trying to pull her into my orbit. I accepted her increasingly frequent nights out without question. Months passed, and this separation only exacerbated the problem. Julia became increasingly self-centered, behaving as though she were the protagonist in some epic narrative, where I was merely a supporting character, someone who existed primarily to fulfill her needs rather than a partner worthy of love. She began acting as though she deserved better, as if staying with me was some great sacrifice on her part. That affected me deeply. I lay awake countless nights, staring at the ceiling fan, trying to identify the moment when I stopped being enough for her. But introspection only confirmed what I already suspected. You cannot rescue someone who has no desire to be saved. No matter how meticulously I designed our life together, I couldn't make her value the blueprint we'd created. Then came the pivotal night that altered our trajectory forever. I had been waiting for hours, watching the digital clock as it ticked well past midnight. When I finally heard her key in the lock, I exhaled slowly, trying to center myself. She entered our living room unsteadily, trailing the unmistakable scent of expensive whiskey. She barely acknowledged my presence as she dropped her designer handbag onto our coffee table and kicked off her heels. I asked her as calmly as I could manage if she realized what she was doing to our marriage. Her response was a dismissive laugh and a cutting remark about how she didn't need me, how numerous men found her desirable, how easily replaceable I was. She stood taller, declaring she was done living by my expectations or anyone else's standards. This was her life, and she was embracing her independence now. Either I accepted it or I didn't. That was the moment I recognized that I had lost her. I didn't argue or plead. She had already determined who she wanted to become, and it wasn't the woman I had married. So I did the only thing that remained. I let her have the life she claimed to want. And I stepped away. The following morning, I contacted the most reputable divorce attorney in downtown Portland. The legal proceedings moved swiftly since we had no children, and I had no desire to fight over possessions. I wasn't even present for the final settlement meeting. Once the papers were signed, I did exactly as I had promised myself. I disappeared completely. Initially, Julia appeared unbothered, perhaps even relieved. She convinced herself this was her fresh start. I caught glimpses of her new life through social media. Photographs at exclusive Portland nightclubs, champagne flute in hand, living as though she were celebrating some great triumph. Her posts featured captions about new beginnings and self-worth, and for a time it seemed she had moved forward without a backward glance. She dove back into dating almost immediately. But something had changed. The men who pursued her weren't looking for profound connection or commitment. They wanted entertainment, not partnership. And the few who were prepared for something meaningful weren't the caliber of men she desired. I wasn't present to witness this firsthand, but word reached me through our mutual connections. She cycled through relationships rapidly, moving from one prospect to the next without finding anything substantial. The attention she had once thrived on gradually became hollow. For the first time, she was genuinely alone, not by choice, but because she had pushed away the one person who had truly valued her. As for me, I refused to look back after finalizing our divorce. I faced a crucial decision. I could have immediately sought another relationship to fill the void, or lost myself in meaningless encounters and temporary distractions. But I recognized that wasn't the solution. I had already spent too long diminishing myself in a marriage where I was invisible. Now was the time to prioritize myself. I channeled my energy into my architectural practice as a means of rebuilding my life. I dedicated myself to growing the firm I had built from conceptual sketches, expanding its scope beyond residential projects into commercial spaces. Work became a tangible reminder that I had purpose beyond being someone's husband. Gradually, I began seeing results. My firm secured several high-profile contracts for sustainable buildings in Seattle and Vancouver. And for the first time in years, I felt I was regaining control over my life's direction. Simultaneously, I focused on my well-being. I joined a climbing gym in the Pearl District because I wanted to reclaim my strength. I began paying attention to nutrition, sleep hygiene, and self-care practices I had neglected for years while trying to save my marriage. I accepted a fundamental truth. Some people will never appreciate you, regardless of how much you give. I refused to settle for anything that didn't contribute genuine value to my life. I wouldn't allow loneliness to trick me into returning to the familiar or pursuing relationships that weren't right for me. I learned to be content in solitude without feeling isolated. I became comfortable with my own company, something I hadn't experienced in years. Slowly but steadily, I flourished. And that, more than anything, was my greatest victory. It had been nearly 4 years since I last saw Julia when fate intervened. I was at Powell's bookstore, browsing the architecture section when I turned a corner and there she was, Julia standing just a few yards away, staring at me as though she'd encountered a ghost. "Ethan?" she finally said, her voice uncertain, almost timid. I nodded, offering a polite smile. "Hey, Julia, it's been a while." She laughed nervously, adjusting her posture. "Wow, you look different." I shrugged. "Life's been good." She began asking questions, attempting to maintain the conversation. I answered casually, never revealing too much. After a few more minutes of superficial conversation, she smiled uncertainly. "Maybe we could catch up sometime?" I smiled back. "Maybe," but I knew we wouldn't, because that chapter of my life was permanently closed. Days after our chance encounter, she reached out with a simple text. Against my better judgment, I replied. From there, the conversation gradually developed. Just small talk, catching up, nostalgia seeping in where anger had once resided. Over the following weeks, we exchanged occasional messages. She would send random thoughts about things that reminded her of me, and despite everything, I couldn't deny the truth. The feelings weren't entirely gone. You don't simply stop loving someone overnight, but what I came to understand was that love alone was insufficient. The trust had long since disintegrated. One evening, she suggested we meet. Just dinner, just conversation. Part of me wanted to agree. But then I asked myself what I was truly seeking. An apology? Some kind of explanation? A chance to repair what was already damaged beyond recovery? Deep down, I recognized the truth. I didn't need Julia to provide closure. I needed to grant it to myself. So I declined, not with bitterness, just a simple, "I don't think that's a good idea." It took considerable time for me to acknowledge how deeply I had been wounded. Julia had inflicted more damage than I initially realized, not just by leaving, but through how she made me feel before her departure. Unworthy, replaceable, perpetually insufficient. I knew if I didn't address it, this weight would follow me everywhere. So I did something I never anticipated. I began therapy. It wasn't initially comfortable, sitting across from a stranger discussing things I had spent years internalizing. But week after week, I gained clarity. I wasn't foolish for loving Julia. I wasn't weak for trying to preserve my marriage. I was simply a man who had given his heart to someone who couldn't value it properly. That wasn't my failure. It was a lesson I needed to learn. Healing wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't about waking up one day suddenly feeling liberated. It was about the accumulation of small moments of growth and understanding. I severed all remaining connections with Julia. Before deleting her contact information, I sent one final message. Not from a place of resentment, just honesty. "I wish you the best." Looking back, I used to believe the only way to move beyond someone who hurt you was to even the score, to prove they had lost something valuable. But I discovered something important. Revenge consumes valuable energy. Sometimes the most effective response isn't retaliation at all. It's simply moving forward, becoming the best version of yourself, and allowing them to observe from a distance. And that, my friends, is precisely what I did. If you enjoyed this story of personal transformation and self-worth, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life experiences. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a similar situation? How did you handle it?